I will briefly just share with you some key messages. As you can imagine, there are volumes and volumes of data out here, and we have the data over 11 years. So you can analyze the data in multiple ways. One key message really is what kind of a future can middle-income economies hope for in innovation? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, China really has shown the way. It's not the only country because Malaysia, Bulgaria also are performing well, but the progress of China has been just simply impressive. This year, China, in absolute terms, exceeds the US in number of patents, number of researchers, number of publications. So in some key parameters, China's overtaken the US already. And if you look at the influence that China has in innovation outputs, innovation impact is really comparable to US levels. And the rate of progress is such that, as Bruno said, many economies can learn from China, and there we can spend much more time, and perhaps the panel can explore it, about why China is doing so well. Another message really is about what kind of economies typically tend to do better on these innovation rankings. In general, you find that higher income economies tend to be higher ranked on the innovation index. That correlation is there. Causality is harder to prove. But in generally, what we find is that high-income economies tend to do better on these rankings. There also has been some questions raised about, do smaller economies do better on the rankings? Somehow is the rankings biased in favor of small economies? Because in the top 10, you notice a lot of small economies out there. And we have data that shows, and out here the scatter plot gives you a quick visual indication, that population is the x-axis and the vertical axis is the ranking on the innovation. There is no real correlation or any direct relationship between size of economy and the ranking. So what it does show is that both large economies and small economies can do well. And what makes the key difference really are the innovation policies, the policies the government puts in place, the policies that support the collaboration across the public and private sectors. We also noticed that among the rich income economies, the more diversified the portfolio of industry and exports that the economy has, the more successful the economies are in innovation. So this, for example, would argue that economies of the US are typically more successful than economies like, let's say, in the Middle East, where the economies are rich, but still they're not diversified. They're very much focused on one sector per se. Now, another point made by Bruno in his comments was examples of countries that invest a lot in innovation, but somehow the outputs do not result in the same proportion. And what we find from our research very clearly is this linkage of innovation investments and the actual output is critical. And the linkages really rely upon some key parameters. One key parameter is the linkage between universities and industry. Some economies are good at that, some are poor at that. And some other linkages rely upon the links between industry and the markets. So once again, there are important lessons out here about how can some economies do better in translating inputs into outputs. We also noticed that there are strong regional imbalances. And what is important to mention is the rankings do normalize the values by size of GDP, of the economy or population, just to have a comparable base to compare countries with each other. But having said that, if you look at the absolute numbers on many innovation parameters, China and the US dominate the space in a big way. So the dark blue is China, and the light blue is the US. And then you have UK, Israel, Singapore, Switzerland there in other colors. And what you see is that China and the US dominate actual quantities of innovation outputs in a dramatic manner. So it's very important to keep that in mind that still today in the world, there are large imbalances, and yet at the same time, some economies are performing extremely well. If you take economies in the same income per capita level, and you actually ask the question, how well do they perform in the innovation rankings, what you find is they are clear underachievers and they are clear overachievers. So some countries do perform better than their peers at the same income level. And given the data we have the ability to identify those countries. So on the right, you see the list of countries out there: Armenia, Bulgaria, Colombia, India, Kenya, Madagascar, Mongolia, Rwanda, Serbia, South Africa, Thailand, and so on. Now, what is interesting when you look at the data is some of these countries may not be your usual country you think of when you think of innovation. But if you think of innovation in the global perspective, it is very important to keep that in mind, that innovation is happening globally, and it's not just only happening in New York City or Silicon Valley. And it's interesting to learn lessons from all these different economies around the world. Two last slides about the theme. Every year for the Innovation Index report, we have, of course, the data collection, which is the core analytical part. We also choose a theme in which we invite experts to submit chapters. Last year, the theme was Innovation in Agriculture. This year, the theme we chose was Innovation Energy. Why? Because we believe energy is critical for the future of society, future of industry. And all projections show that we will have shortages, serious shortages of energy, unless we are able to innovate. And innovation is critical in all the different components of the energy life cycle: generation, transmission, distribution, consumption, and storage. So it's not just in one component. What we see are the necessity for innovations in all parts of the value chain in energy. And what we also believe is that you need a lot of collaboration out here across industry, academia, to make this happen. Now, we are seeing some worrying signs out here that in some areas, the number of patents in energy are declining. But having said this, this is something that can be corrected, and can be corrected by appropriate public policy. Public policy that fundamentally makes the governments, industry, and academia work together to try and address some of the shortcomings out here.